By the late autumn of 1944, a dangerous and narcotic complacency had settled over the Allied high command in Europe. The war, according to the newspapers in London and New York, was all but won. The frantic summer of liberation was over. Paris had been freed with champagne, kisses, and flowers. The broken remnants of the German Wehrmacht had retreated in disarray across the Rhine River, leaving behind a trail of burning equipment and shattered morale. To the strategic planners at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, in Versailles, the Nazi regime appeared to be a corpse that simply hadn't stopped twitching. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's armies stretched like a massive steel coil from the North Sea to the Swiss border, poised to strike into the industrial heart of Germany. Intelligence reports painted a picture of an enemy on the brink of total collapse. They estimated that Germany had fewer than 500 battle-ready tanks left on the entire Western Front. They believed the once fearsome Luftwaffe was grounded permanently due to a critical lack of aviation fuel. The prevailing wisdom among the British and American generals was that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aged and aristocratic German commander in the West, was a rational man who would fight a rational, defensive war. They believed he would conserve his remaining strength behind the concrete fortifications of the Siegfried Line and try to negotiate a surrender before the Russians took Berlin. But the Allies were fighting the wrong war. They were fighting a war of logic, of maps and statistics. Adolf Hitler, trembling in his concrete bunker, was no longer operating on logic. He was operating on the desperate mania of a gambler with one chip left. While the Allies planned their Christmas dinners in Brussels and Paris, a massive, silent machinery was turning in the deep, dark, pine forests of the Eifel region. Under the strictest secrecy, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler was assembling a ghost army. He stripped the Eastern Front of its best armor. He pulled teenage boys from high schools and old men from factories to fill the ranks of the new Volksgrenadier divisions. He amassed over 1.500 tanks, including the terrifying Tiger II, King Tigers, 2.000 artillery pieces, and over 250.000 men. He hid them in the dense forests, moving only at night, using charcoal to darken their faces and straw to muffle the sound of tank treads. They were positioned directly opposite a sector of the Allied line known as the Ghost Front, the Ardennes. The American commanders used the Ardennes as a resting ground, a quiet sector where nothing ever happened. They believed the terrain, steep ravines, narrow roads, and dense woods, was too rugged for tanks to traverse in winter. They stationed their greenest units there, tired divisions resting from the Hurtgen forest battles and raw recruits who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The trap was set. Hitler waited for only one thing, the Hitler weather. He needed a heavy blanket of fog and snow that would ground the superior Allied Air Force, blinding the Americans to the doom gathering just a few miles away. Amidst this sea of Allied overconfidence, there was one headquarters that did not share the optimism. Located in the dark, muddy city of Nancy, France, was the headquarters of the U.S. Third Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton was a man of contradictions, a vulgar, cursing cavalryman who wrote sensitive poetry, a devout Christian who believed in reincarnation, a disciplinarian who slapped soldiers but wept openly over their graves. By December 1944, he was a caged lion. The Allied supply lines were stretched thin, and precious fuel was being diverted to Field Marshal Montgomery in the north for a failed attempt to cross the Rhine, stalling Patton's advance in the south. He paced his office like a restless animal, sensing something was wrong. While other generals were looking at the map of Germany, aiming for the Rhine, Patton was looking at the map of the Ardennes. Patton had a secret weapon. A man who remains one of the unsung heroes of World War II, Colonel Oscar Koch. His G2, intelligence officer. Koch was a brilliant pessimist in a room full of optimists. While SHAEF intelligence dismissed German radio silence as a sign of weakness and lack of equipment, Koch interpreted it as a sign of operational security for an impending strike. In early December, Koch began placing red thumbtacks on the large situation map in Patton's war room. Each tack represented a German panzer division that had mysteriously disappeared from the front lines. "They aren't gone, George," Koch told Patton, his voice low and serious. "They are massing. They are waiting." Patton studied the map, chewing on his cigar. He saw what Eisenhower and Bradley did not. He saw the classic German Schwerpunkt, the concentration of force at a single point to achieve a breakthrough. "If they hit," Patton growled, pointing a leather-gloved finger at the map. "They'll hit the 8th Corps. It's the soft underbelly. And when they do, they'll try to drive to Antwerp to cut us in half." On December 12, 4 days before the German attack, Patton did something extraordinary. He stopped planning his own offensive into the Saar region. He called his key staff officers, Colonel Paul Harkins, Operations, and Colonel Molly Haley, Logistics, into his office. "I want you to make a plan," Patton said quietly. "We're going to have to move. I want plans for a withdrawal from our current front and a 90-degree turn to the north." His staff was stunned. They were winning in the south. Why plan a retreat? Why prepare to abandon hard-won ground? "Because," Patton said, his eyes narrowing with a predator's instinct, "the Krauts are up to something. And when the hell breaks loose up north, Ike is going to call me. I want to be ready to move before he even hangs up the phone." It was a premonition that would save the Allied cause. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, the Ghost Front exploded. The silence of the snowy Ardennes was shattered by the roar of 2,000 German guns firing simultaneously. The earth shook as shells rained down on the sleeping American soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division. Inside their foxholes, young Americans woke to a nightmare. The sky was on fire. The noise was a physical blow. Then came the screaming Mimes, the German Nebelwerfer rocket launchers that made a terrifying howling sound as they fired. Out of the mist came the monsters, Tiger II tanks, massive 70-ton beasts that were virtually impervious to American anti-tank weapons. Behind them came waves of white-clad German infantry, screaming and firing MP-40 submachine guns. The American line didn't just bend, in places. It shattered. The sheer weight of the German 6th Panzer Army, led by the ruthless SS General Sepp Dietrich, and the 5th Panzer Army under the aristocratic Hasso von Manteuffel, rolled over the American positions. Confusion reigned. Telephone lines were cut by German saboteurs disguised as American MPs, Operation Grief. Led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, road signs were changed to send reinforcements in the wrong direction. Units were cut off and annihilated. By December 18, the magnitude of the disaster was undeniable. The Germans had driven a Bulge 60 miles deep into the Allied lines. Panic began to spread in Paris. There were rumors that German assassination squads were hunting Eisenhower. The Allied command structure was paralyzed by the shock of the offensive. Eisenhower realized he had only one card left to play. He needed a hammer to smash the German flank. He needed the only general the Germans feared. He ordered a meeting of all senior commanders at Verdun for the morning of December 19. The conference room in the French barracks at Verdun was damp and cold, heated only by a single pot-bellied stove that did little to dispel the chill. The mood was funereal. Eisenhower stood at the front, his face gray with exhaustion and stress. Around him sat the most powerful men in the Allied military: General Omar Bradley, General Jacob Devers, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, and General George Patton. Eisenhower opened the meeting. "The present situation is to be regarded as an opportunity for us and not a disaster," he said, trying to project confidence. "There will be only cheerful faces at this table." But the map told a different story. The German advance was threatening to cross the Meuse River. If they did, the way to Brussels and Antwerp was open. Eisenhower laid out his plan. He wanted Patton to stop his offensive in the Saar, turn his army north, and attack the southern flank of the German Bulge. Eisenhower looked at Patton, his eyes searching for reassurance. "George, I want you to go to Luxembourg and take charge of the battle. When can you start?" The room went silent. The only sound was the wind rattling the window panes. The other generals began doing mental math. To disengage a massive army of 250,000 men from active combat, turn them around on icy roads, and launch a coordinated attack usually took weeks. Patton stood up. He was wearing his polished helmet and his pistol belt with the ivory-handled revolvers. He looked fresh, eager, almost happy. "I can attack on the morning of December 22, Patton said, "with 3 divisions. A collective gasp went through the room. December 22 was only 48 hours away. One British officer dropped his pencil. "Don't be fatuous, George," Eisenhower snapped, his patience fraying. "This is serious. You can't move 3 divisions that fast. You have to disengage them first, then move them over icy roads." Patton lit a cigar, the smoke curling up towards the peeling paint of the ceiling. "Sir, I have already made plans," Patton replied calmly. "I have alerted the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry. They are already moving. My codes are ready. My supply trains are loading. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Eisenhower stared at him. He realized then that Patton was not boasting. While the rest of them had been panicking, Patton had been working. A smile touched Eisenhower's lips. All right, George, he said softly, if you can do that, you might just save our necks. But the weather is against you. Patton smiled a wolfish smile. I'm on good terms with the Lord. Ike, I'll handle the weather. Patton left the meeting at Verdun and stepped into his jeep. Drive like hell, he told his driver. What followed was the most complex logistical maneuver in the history of the U.S. Army. It was a ballet of steel and gasoline performed on a stage of ice. Patton had to move 133.000 vehicles and over 200.000 men a distance of 100 miles. Crossing the supply lines of other armies. In the middle of a blizzard. In total radio silence, he turned the Third Army 90 degrees. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. Patton was everywhere. He stood at crossroads in the freezing wind, his face red with cold, screaming at his MPs, if a truck breaks down, push it into the ditch and keep moving. The men in Bastogne are dying. He threatened, he cajoled, he inspired. The soldiers called him Old Blood and Guts, and they marched until their feet bled because they knew the old man was watching. Inside the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were surrounded. They had no winter clothes, low ammunition, and little food. The Germans pounded them with artillery day and night. The German commander sent a message demanding their surrender to avoid total annihilation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply that would become legend: nuts. But bravery wouldn't stop tanks. They needed Patton. Back at his headquarters in Luxembourg City, Patton was fighting his own battle. The weather was atrocious. Fog and snow grounded the Allied aircraft that Patton needed to support his tanks. He watched the gray sky with fury. He called for his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. Chaplain, Patton barked, I want you to write a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of my soldiers having to fight the mud and the Germans at the same time. See if we can't get God on our side. Chaplain O'Neill, somewhat taken aback, wrote the prayer. Patton had it printed on 250.000 small cards and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. It read, Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee, grant us fair weather for battle, crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Patton knelt in a cold church in Luxembourg and prayed. He bargained with God. He demanded clear skies so he could kill Germans. And then, the miracle happened. On the morning of December 23rd, the skies over the Ardennes suddenly cleared. The sun broke through. It was a freezing, brilliant blue sky. Patton rushed out of his headquarters. He looked up and saw hundreds of C-47 transport planes flying towards Bastogne to drop supplies. He saw P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers diving on German tank columns. God damn it, Patton shouted, slapping his thigh. Look at that, the chaplain actually did it. He jumped into his jeep. Get me to the front. The 4th Armored is going in. The tip of Patton's spear was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey. But the man leading the charge on the ground was a cigar-chomping lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, the man the modern M1 Abrams tank is named after. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion. His orders from Patton were simple: drive to Bastogne. Don't stop, do not count your losses. The road to Bastogne was a corridor of death. The elite German 5th Parachute Division and elements of the Panzer Lehr Division blocked the way. They had dug in 88mm anti-tank guns into the frozen earth. They mined the roads. They blew the bridges. For 3 days and nights, Patton's men fought without sleep. It was a brutal, close-quarters slugfest. Tanks fought at point-blank range in snow-covered villages like Chaumont and Bougainville. The cold was so intense that machine guns froze and had to be urinated on to keep firing. Patton was a presence that permeated the battlefield. He relieved commanders who he thought were too slow. He walked through aid stations, looking at the broken bodies of his men. We have to keep moving, he told a bloody tanker. If we stop, they die in Bastogne. We are their only hope. On Christmas Day, December 25th, the 4th Armored was still 6 miles from Bastogne. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne was holding on by a thread. The German attacks were getting stronger. They were trying to crush the pocket before Patton could arrive. Patton called Creighton Abrams on the radio. Abe, Patton said, I know you're tired, but I need you to break through tomorrow. Tomorrow is the day. Abrams looked at his men. They were exhausted, their faces black with grease and gunpowder, their eyes red from lack of sleep. He climbed into his lead tank, a Sherman named Thunderbolt. Load armor piercing. Abrams commanded, "We're going to Eisenhower." Between Abrams and Bastogne lay the village of Eisenhower, heavily defended by German paratroopers. To get to the 101st, they would have to drive straight through hell. Abrams decided on a tactic of suicidal bravery. He ordered the artillery to pound the village, and then he ordered his tanks to charge while the artillery was still falling. It was madness. It was brilliant. The American tanks roared down the hill into Eisenhower, the ground exploding around them from their own shells. The Germans, huddled in their cellars to escape the bombardment, were shocked to see Sherman tanks rolling past their windows before the shelling even stopped. Machine guns blazed, tracks crushed the snow, and in a chaotic fury of steel and fire, the 4th Armored punched through. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, the lead tank, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bogus, spotted green figures in the distance. They were digging foxholes. Bogus didn't fire. He called out. The figures stood up. They were engineers of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. The Bulge was pierced. The German offensive was crushed. Following the relief of Bastogne, Patton did not stop. He continued to drive his army into the heart of the German lines, pushing them back across the border. The German High Command, observing the collapse of their last great gamble, realized their worst fears had come true. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, reviewing the reports of Patton's 90-degree turn and the lightning speed of his counterattack, sat in his headquarters, a defeated man. He offered a final, somber assessment to his staff. He admitted that Patton was the only Allied general who truly understood the fluidity of war. The Germans had hoped for a slow, methodical Allied response. They had counted on bureaucracy and caution. Instead, they got George Patton. They got a commander who ignored the rulebook, who fought the weather and won, and who executed the impossible in 48 hours. In the end, the generals who had invented the Blitzkrieg were defeated by an American who had mastered it better than they ever could. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a victory of American courage, it was the ultimate triumph of Patton's philosophy of war, speed, aggression, and the sheer force of will. The ghost of the Ardennes had been exorcised by the ghost of Patton.